Bonsoir, bienvenue. Nous sommes ravis que vous soyez parmi nous ce soir, whether it's online or here in the room. This is our first Writers Out Loud event of 2024 and our fourth collaboration with Muslim Awareness Week. So we're very happy to be here to celebrate with you those two events. My name is Laurie Schubert. I'm the Executive Director of the Quebec Writers Federation. And before we get started, QWF would like to invite you to give thanks and remember. We give thanks for the land we live on and the waters that surround us. And we remember that Jojage, the land upon which QWF has made its home, has been a gathering place for millennia and still remains the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka and other First Nations. We recognize the stories and ongoing oral practices of the Indigenous peoples of these lands, which inform our work as writers and literary artists. We remember that we, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, settlers, immigrants, and people brought here against their will, live in this country together. We must never forget our experiences and roles and those of our ancestors in colonization and subsequent injustices, and must strive to live alongside one another in peace, mutual respect, and as allies to steward the lands and waters that sustain us. We must walk gently and respectfully on these lands and commit to investing QWF resources and efforts towards this goal in friendship, esteem, and in the pursuit of justice and equality. Our host for the evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce, is Samaa Elibyari. Samaa has been a long-time activist in the Arab and Muslim community. In particular, she's been involved with the Montreal chapter of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women since its inception in 1983. From 1990 to 2010, Samaa co-hosted and produced Caravan, a bilingual radio program on CKUT, Community McGill Campus Radio. She is here today both as a board member of Muslim Awareness Week 2024 and, as I said, as our moderator for the evening. It's been a great pleasure for me to work with Samaa for the last 4 years. I'm sure you'll enjoy working with her tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I'm very grateful for Quebec Writers Federation for giving me this opportunity to interview two celebrated authors who take inspiration from events related to the Middle East. Ian Thomas Joe is a Canadian born in Vancouver. We will be talking about his second novel, Quill of the Dove, a compelling tale of idealism, courage, and the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. Ehab Lotayef was born in Cairo and moved to Montreal in 1989. Ehab is a dedicated activist. He is also a poet, songwriter, and playwright. His play, Crossing Gibraltar, was produced in 2005 by CBC Radio. We will talk about his book of poems, To Love a Palestinian Woman. This event is part of Muslim Awareness Week, which we stretch till this evening. Officially, the week starts on the 25th of January and ends on the 31st. Welcome, Ian. Welcome, Ehab. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to start with a classic question. First for Ian. For the last 33 years, you have been a diplomat and an international aid worker living in Africa, Lebanon, the Middle East. Now you have founded a publishing company, Les Deux Voiliers, and you are also an author. When did you first realize you wanted to be a writer?
Thank you. So most of my life I've been a writer. That's how I earn my living, by writing for the government, for NGOs and the like, and a very specific audience. So when I worked as a diplomat, you had to have a high security clearance even to read anything I wrote. So at a certain point, about 12 years ago, I thought, it'd be fun to write for other people, to write fiction, and not just factual things and analyses. And so my problem was I was a diplomat, and I had to be very careful about what I could write. And it was during the period of the Harper government, and the Harper government wanted to keep very, very tight reins over any type of civil servant. So I chose a pen name, Con Cu, which means in Vietnamese owl. And I chose to write a novel that dealt with how people dealt with trauma. One person was a Vietnamese refugee who was traumatized as a child. One person was a Canadian that was traumatized during his late teens or even later. And I want to intertwine their stories very much to show that how human beings are traumatized and how they deal with trauma is a very universal theme. And it's not based on culture or geography, that really trauma goes right to the core of the human existence, and how we respond to trauma can be in different forms, but all these forms are very valid. So I started to write my novel under a pseudonym. And at first I self-published it, and then I decided that I should publish with other people. And I formed a writers collective and a publishing collective, and that's what Devoilier is. We have a group of members that write their own works, and we publish it and we bring it to a fairly high standard. And then we encourage all our members to go to traditional publishers for their second or third novel. And for the most part, that's what's happened. We've had some very successful authors coming out of the collective.
Congratulations. For Ehab, you are an information technology engineer at McGill University and a well-known activist in Montreal. Did you think about writing as a career?
Lori won't like this. Thank God, no. I know I'm blessed because I know how some writers struggle to make ends meet through writing as a career. I'm lucky enough that writing was always a serious hobby for me. It's more really than a hobby in the practical sense, but I never depended on it on making ends meet. So that gave me a lot of flexibility to write when I want, write what I want, and not have to calculate when I will get out something to a publisher or to an editor or stuff like that.
So you're writing for pleasure?
I'm writing to live. Because writing for me helped me a lot to really navigate the world and get my thoughts, sometimes my frustrations, sometimes my nice feelings. Maybe those who know me maybe know that that's rare, but yeah, it helps me live.
Okay, so I'll go to the next question. For both of you, what inspires you, Ian? You wrote two novels, very different novels. So I'd like to know if there is some line of thought behind what you write.
So I would like to think that what I write provides information to people that they don't necessarily already have. So a lot of my fiction is very political in nature. And I do it in a way which is not as an activist. It's a way of trying to present both sides of the picture in a more objective way to avoid stereotypes and allow people to draw their own conclusions about what otherwise seems to them to be very complicated issues. And I draw on my own background, living in the Middle East in particular, to try to present a more balanced view of the Middle East conflict and also other regional conflicts such as the civil war in Lebanon. So that inspires me if I can improve the knowledge of the reader about things that normally they would be reading about in the media. And sometimes in the media, there's a lot of bias and a lot of distortion of what is really happening. And also in the media, when you read things through the media, you don't feel the empathy. You read about the numbers, you read about death, you read about destruction, but the human connection with the people that are suffering from conflicts, you don't necessarily feel. But through fiction, I think you can arrive at having the readers empathize with the various people affected by conflict. And so that's what sort of, that drives me. But I also like the writing process in general. I enjoy it. I enjoy words, I enjoy editing, I enjoy translation.
What about you, Ehab? What inspires you?
I would say raw feelings. I do write op-eds, opinion pieces as well, some what you can call political or social analysis. And for that, I choose the topic that I'm going to write on. I choose the analysis I want to present. But when I'm talking about artistic writing, whether it's poetry or my rare trying my hand in theater or in short stories, I do that really out of raw feelings. And if it does carry a political or social message, it carries it because it comes from the gut. I don't usually, in the most cases, try to send a message through a poem or through a song or through a work of art.
Now, in your book of poems, some of the poems you write underneath, inspired by so-and-so, by other authors. So what is the difference between inspiration and plagiarism?
It is a very good question, particularly that sometimes I'm very much in doubt myself when I know, for example, a verse or a short poem in Arabic that I want to express it in English, and I feel a bit guilty that the idea is not genuinely my idea, but the idea is taken from that, and that's why I make a point in quoting it. And sometimes when I send out such poems, I even send the Arabic original with them so that people would know. But I think that plagiarism in today's world is a huge problem, and maybe it's becoming more easy and more difficult at the same time. It's not an area of speciality of mine, but I would be very concerned about it if I see that somebody took my words and my ideas and claimed them for themselves. But on the other hand, we are living in a very interactive world that people are affected by others, and much more so as the media comes more accessible, social media, etc. So it's a dangerous slippery slope.
Now, for Ian, you were talking about how to describe real situations, real life, and real people. And I'm reading your book. I felt it was so authentic, so real. But I kept on reminding myself, oh no, this is fiction. So how can a reader draw the line? Isn't this dangerous?
I think the danger is when you don't succeed in convincing the reader at some point in your novel that it could be real. I think that's where you fail. You know, fiction is not to present an exact portrait of what's happened in anyone's past. It's to create a past which is plausible, a story which is plausible because it relates to things that do happen in life, but also relates to the feelings that people have about the things that happen in life. And you have to kind of bring that together. You have to weave that together. And then it's a good sign if the reader believes at some point that maybe this is autobiographical or biographical. In my writing is not biographical. But I will say when I write about a character or when I write about a place, I am thinking about some place in my life that I've been to. I am thinking about someone I may have met. but maybe not in that place. And I try to weave together the character and the place and the plot to really draw in the reader to enjoy the story.
Yeah, you're both writing about difficult political subjects. So for Ian, I recognize the peace plan that you are presenting in your book. You got many favorable comments from reviewers. It isn't exactly the resolution taken by the UN that we are familiar with. I considered it lacking an essential issue. Your comments, did you have any read?
First, oh, that's good to know. Just before I say about Adil Sharqawi, right? You wanted to make sure I understand that. Okay, no, this is a very good question. You know why it's a good question?
Thank you.
Because injustice doesn't, I mean, if you have accusations or if you have reservations about a person or a group, that doesn't mean that you should not defend them if they are subjected to injustice. When I wrote about Adil Sharqawi, and I'm not issuing a judgment about him now, but I'm issuing a judgment about the Canadian law called security certificates. When I wrote about Adil Sharqawi was under security certificate, which is a law in Canadian law books that should not exist in any respectable democracy. It is a law where if two ministers sign on a certificate, no evidence has to be given, and the person can be subjected to indefinite imprisonment by the state. And Adil Sharqawi and 5 other men were subjected to that over the years. And this is injustice, and I sympathize and will continue to sympathize with anybody who is subjected to something like that. And I want to add one more point since we got into this topic. And in my opinion, I know Adil quite well, and I consider him very hardline. Some people consider him a fanatic at this point. Some people consider him even more. But I would say that the experience that the Canadian government put him through could have contributed to this. So let's also be fair towards people and towards peoples in general when we discuss this matter. I didn't get any negative comments about my poem about Adil Sharqawi, by the way.
For both of you, do you think writing expressing controversial ideas can be popular?
Sorry?
Writing about controversial subjects can be popular? I mean, can you sell books if you're writing about the Middle East, or if Ehab is writing about controversial figures? Is this something lucrative?
Well, for me, it's not lucrative, like many members of the QWF. But then again, a bit like Ehab, I've never had to rely on my writing to make a living. But I would say, I'll give you one book, which is very different from mine, which made a person a multimillionaire, and that's the book Exodus by Leon Uris. And virtually the entire planet has read Exodus, and it did influence the way people saw this conflict for many, many decades. I would say it was a good book, but it influenced them in a damaging way because it romanticized one side and it demonized another side. And I think in what I'm trying to do is the opposite. I'm not interested in demonizing anyone. Of course, in my novel, there is one person who is a psychopath, and the reasons for him becoming a psychopath come out during the novel, but most of the people in the novel are fairly rational human beings at the start, and you see what happens to them through conflict. Some maintain their humanity and their desire for peace, and other people get into conflict, that they're promoting one side of the conflict. So the question is, if you write something which is highly political, I don't think it affects the bottom line of your book sales. It might actually increase them.
Hopefully.
But it can make it a little uncomfortable at times when you have friendships across different communities and people see your writing through one particular lens. I wasn't too worried about that because my entire life I've dealt with people that are very strong in one point of view or very strong in the other point of view. And I've always been able to sit down with them one-on-one and explain what I think and resolving those type of issues.
You're both writers, so I assume that you like writing. I mean, you enjoy it. So my question for Ian, you talk about terrible situations in your book. I mean, murder, deceit, rape, just to mention a few of them. Isn't it hard to write about such harrowing events? And this type of image, when you think about them, to write about them, isn't it demoralizing? I mean, what's humanity coming to?
That is a very good question,
It makes two questions now, two good questions.
So the genre that I write in, at least for my second novel, is very much a mixture of the thriller genre and then literary fiction. This is what I'm trying to do. And in the thriller fiction, what I find is that death and the killing of people is presented in a very banal way, as if we're all in a video game and we're shooting at people and they're just dying. And this dehumanizes people. What I tried to do in my novel was to show the real impact of conflict on civilians as such. What happened. And I also wanted to show the impact of conflict on combatants as well, and why they started to engage in acts which were at least borderline terrorist acts on both sides, and what pushed them to it. So again, I want to put the human being at the center of the writing. And I think in the thriller genre, they do exactly the opposite. They glorify the hero, usually a CIA agent or someone like that, and everyone else, the Russians or the Iranians, are all these demonized people who have no humanity. So I tried to do the opposite in my novel. Do I find it, what was the word, demoralizing to write this?
That's right, so hard to write about this.
Well, I think what I find demoralizing is when I go on the news every day and I see the actual cost in 2024 of these conflicts, how civilians, children, and women, are dying. And I find that demoralizing. So compared to the level of violence that exists in my novels, I think there's a world apart. Perhaps my novels are a little light compared to the reality of today. So if the novel serves to raise people's awareness of the impact of war and violence and conflict on civilian populations, so that when there is real conflict happening in the world, they start to speak out and give a voice to those that do not have the voice because they're on the suffering side, then that is a very small achievement, And I would hope that someone reading my last novel would come away with it and with some reflections in that regard.
Ehab poetry has a reputation of being a leisurely pursuit. While reading your book, To Love a Palestinian Woman, I felt kind of depressed. Why are your poems so sad?
Because the world is sad? Because I am sad? I don't know. But really, I express what I see and what I feel in my books and in my poems, and I don't think of what they're gonna be. But maybe, as Ian said, and as your question about the pictures that are depicted in works, maybe they're a wake-up call for people. I have some happy poems, but they're few and far apart.
Now, I will return to the role and image of women in both your writings. Ian, women play an important role in your book, more so for Huda and Mary. They dispel so many myths, especially Huda, who lives in Lebanon during the war between factions. I like this very much. So you were trying to empower women?
So first, I am a male author, so I'm very cautious when I say that I write to empower women, because I'm sure that people reading my writing will say, well, wait a minute, all the women in your novel are very beautiful, so therefore you can't be empowering women. So I'll take those criticisms for what they are, but in the case of Huda, I did want to show a Muslim woman who decides to support a secular political party in Lebanon because she believes in the coexistence of the Christians and the Muslims and the Druze in Lebanon. And she supports the one party that really espouses this, and she gets very involved with it and does a lot of work. She becomes a courier, she risks her life, and she's very, very strong. Okay, so I wanted to, I don't know if the word is to attack, but I wanted to confront the image of Muslim women in the West. The Muslim women in the West are seen passive, they're seen as being non-political, that they don't think for themselves, and that they wear, for example, they wear hijab because their brothers and fathers insist that they wear hijab, as opposed to wearing a hijab because of religious conviction and their own personal choice. So I think that in Canadian society and in Western society, there is a distorted picture of Muslim women. And I lived in the Middle East for many, many years, and I met many strong Muslim women that had their opinions and the like. So I want to capture in the person of Huda that personality. And then in the personality of Marie Boivin, who grows up in a French-Canadian society, it was more of a question of finding a woman who was also strong, but at the same time, she wanted to find her own heritage. She was seeking answers to her past. And I think that is perhaps a more conventional role of women in literature, that the role of women in literature is often conveyed as the more emotional, the more effective personalities in novels. I also want to respect that role of the feminine role in my own novel.
Yeah, she was attractive, men used to leer at her and so on. Yeah. So that was right. very evident.
I'm a male author, and you take pleasure in writing, and if you take pleasure in writing about someone and you envision them as being extremely attractive in many senses, intellectually and physical beauty, I see no harm in that. Although I'll take the criticism that some people that will say male authors fantasize over their female characters. I think there's some truth in that, but if it drives the writer to get the story out and to create personalities that are attractive to the readers, for me, I see no harm.
She's definitely sexy. For Ehab.
Keep going like that. People will buy the book now.
The title of your book is To Love a Palestinian Woman. You chose this title because people always open their eyes and ears when they hear there is a woman?
No. Okay, let me come clean on this, because this is something that many people even made statements on my behalf on the internet about the title of this book, because many people know that I was married to a Palestinian woman and we separated and we continue to be good friends and mutual respect between us. But so many people wrote on the internet, unbeknown to me where they got that from, that I wrote this book after we separated because I regretted our separation and I wanted to and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, this is people's imagination. I guess Nizar Qabbani, the famous Arabic poet, said one day, I had to move my bed to the curb of the street so people can buy my poetry. But I didn't do that. I didn't intend to do that. But this poem actually is not about a particular woman. It's about the strength of the Palestinian women in general. It's about an experience I had in one of my visits to the West Bank, where I was visiting one of the women activists who had like 3-4 children of different ages. And I was inspired by one thing she said. She said that the men can carry arm or do physical resistance, and then they get caught and they're thrown in prison for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And who's left to face the world? Who's left to bring up the kids? Who's left to care for society in general in these kind of situations? And that was one inspiration of this poem, that again the editor is the one who chose it to be the title of the book. But for anyone who reads the poem, it is, in my opinion, it's very clear it's a poem about resistance, not a poem about love.
Now I will turn to translation. For Ian, I loved your snippets in Arabic, especially the insults. Oh, they bring a local flavor. Is your book translated in Arabic yet?
It's not translated in Arabic yet, you know. I would love it to be translated into Arabic, although I could see many Arabic readers being quite critical of the book. For instance, I'll give you an example. There are remarks about Yasser Arafat that I heard myself when I lived in the region, but I could see some Palestinian readers being very upset over the fact that I had one of my characters repeat some of these remarks. There are remarks about Israelis, you know, that others will not like. So, but I would still like it to be translated into Arabic. And I would also like it to be translated to Hebrew. You know, I would, it sort of would be a bit of a dream to see the book come out in Hebrew and in Arabic at the same time. Because there is an audience out there where there is a union in terms of seeing the future between people in Israel and people in Palestine. And it's very difficult to say Israel and Palestine because we're talking about the same land, you know, and whether we have a geographical division between the two or we have one state, in people's minds, they will see the country as Israel and other people will see it as Palestine. I see nothing wrong with that. In fact, in mandatory Palestine, on the banknotes, it used to say Philistine or Palestine in the dialect, and it would say Eretz Israel in Hebrew, and then it would say Palestine in English. So there was a point where how people saw the land was not that they were in conflict with each other, they just had a different way of seeing the land. And personally, I would like to see that happen again, where people, because of their backgrounds, their religious beliefs, will see the land as one, but in coexistence as a possibility, and realize that in order for coexistence in the same land to exist, they have to abandon those leaders, political leaders, that are calling for sectarianism. They're calling for one side to fight against the other in a perpetual cycle of violence. Not for one side to surrender to the other, but for both sides to surrender to the idea of equality and democracy and coexistence. So that's a very idealistic thing. And I would love to see the reaction from a Hebrew-speaking audience and from an Arabic-speaking audience to the novel, because perhaps in criticizing the novel or agreeing with things in the novel, it could stimulate a dialogue between the people that should be talking to each other.
Ehab, you have translated some of your poems from Arabic to English. I wonder if this does justice to the original version.
Never. Of course, the short answer is never. And this is always a struggle that I live with because many of the people interested to see my poems are not Arabic speakers. And when I want to share the ideas in the poem, I have to, or when I want to share the poem to a mixed audience, I mean, it's unfair not to share the ideas of what was written. I'm getting a bit better after many years to be able to create a sort of poem in English that parallels the poem in Arabic. But it will never be faithful to, I mean, you can't translate poetry in general from one language to the other because poetry depends on so many factors. Important to me, one of them is the musicality of it and also the images, which are not the same in different languages. So you lose a lot when you translate.
Ian, did you work with a developmental editor, as they call them, to help you identify any issues?
I worked with an editor. I worked with Michael Marola of Guernica Editions, who's very well known. He's got 60 years of editing experience. He's a co-publisher of Guernica Editions. But he didn't feel a need to get into a developmental edit of the book. You know, he liked the novel, and it was more on technical issues, you know, stylistic issues, things like that, that we worked on. Were I to rewrite the novel, I think I would very much enjoy working with a developmental editor for the purpose of rendering the novel more accessible to the readers. As it currently exists, the novel is fine for you, Samaa, because you know the region, etc. But for a normal English Canadian reader or American reader, it's a bit of a challenge for them to understand what's taking place in the novel. And that can seem to them that the novel is too didactic for them. It's trying to teach them a lesson because they don't know about the background. So some of that could certainly be improved. It's something that I'm going to be trying to do in my own writing, is to bring the writing down to the common knowledge of people about events, and then find a way to bring people along to a better understanding, as opposed to assuming that people will go to Google, will read other articles in order to understand better the novel. So that's a challenge, and that's something where a developmental editor can certainly help out. When I did the French translation of the novel myself with the assistance of another translator and two Francophone authors. And then when I went to the publisher and he accepted it, there was another editor. And that editor it was very interesting because he was a Franco-Ontarian editor, and his knowledge base was maybe at this level about the Middle East. And there's a lot I had to explain, and there were decisions that we would be putting in footnotes for the reader. So the French version of the novel is actually more accessible to a reader in Canada in French than the English version was, which assumed that the person, if they didn't quite understand something, they would go to the internet and find some more information on it. Yeah.
Only through footnotes. Only through footnotes,
not. Only through footnotes, but sometimes we rephrased it, and there were in the novel. There's quite a few Arabic words there, and they're in dialect for the most part. And actually, it was very interesting because when we did the French translation, they took an Arabic Lebanese woman actually read it through and pointed out how I made some spelling mistakes in some of my Arabic. And I had to admit, that she was right. So we corrected a couple of spots, where the Arabic was not exactly what you would say, I'll give you an example of that. The phalanges were a movement in Lebanon, and I used the word phalange. And in Arabic, it's katayib. Of course, I knew it was katayib, but for some reason, maybe I heard it from someone once, phalange. So I threw in phalange as if it was the Arabic word. That was a big mistake. It's not said in Arabic, but in my mind because most of the Arabic in it was dialect, and it's what I remembered, right? And I remembered that wrong.
What about you, Ehab? Do you run it by someone who would tell you you're going to get into trouble if you publish this?
No. I worked with an editor in my play Crossing Gibraltar, a playwright editor, because it was, other than a couple of short community theater pieces, I hadn't experience in writing plays and theater. So the CBC, actually, when they were interested to produce the play, they assigned me an editor that I worked with, a developmental editor, more than an editor, to develop the, and it stayed, it stayed faithful to my vision, but it helped me structure it as a theater piece. Regarding poetry, my interaction with the editor of the publishing house was very minimal, and all the poems were already in their final form, more or less, when presented. So there was very little changes to the manuscript as presented.
Now, what are your plans for the future, both of you? Ian, you said you have a third novel about to be published?
No, I don't have a third novel. I have an idea of a third novel, but I finished an anthology of short stories. So there's various contributors. I contributed, and others. Caroline Vu here contributed. Cora Seri contributed, and it's called Green to Gray, which is an anthology on the environment and what's happening with global warming, but through fiction. And that will come out with Guernica Editions in 2025. It's already finished. It's laid out, everything, but they will put it out in 2025. And then I've done a translation of another novel written by an American author by the name of Timothy Needleman, who's also a member of the QWF because he lived in Montreal for many years. And we published it in English about 10 years ago. It's called Wall of Dust, and it deals with the West Bank. And I decided that I would work with a French-Canadian translator, because I translate myself, but in order to get right, we would put it into French. And now we're looking for a publishing house to publish it. So we sent it off to several publishers in France and Switzerland. We'll see what happens with that. So that's just done. And I think I would like to do one more translation from French into English, and then I'll get back to writing original fiction. So those are my literary projects, and I still continue with the Devoilier Writers Collective with special projects. So this winter this fall, we'll be putting out a translation from German into English by a very well-known Canadian translator, Louise von Floto. And it's in German, it's called Laufen, running, and probably we'll call it running in English as well. And it's a very interesting story written by a German author that did very well in Germany, and we bought the rights for it, and now we're going to put it out to make it available in English. So there's all these little writing projects and translation projects that are keeping me active.
Would you allow me to make a suggestion? Did you think about turning your book into a movie? Because every time I turned a page, I said, oh my God, that would be great as a movie.
So there's a history to that. It was a great disappointment to me that the novel was optioned for a TV limited series by a company in Toronto called Original Pictures. And when you option a novel, it means you have the rights to turn it into either a movie or TV series, etc. And their intention was to put it into a limited TV series. That was done way back in 2020. And then they looked around for scriptwriters to turn it into a script. And there were 6 scriptwriters they approached, and they all said no. And so the company decided not to pursue it, you know. Now, why did they say no? Maybe it was the nature of the novel, that it was complex with flashback chapters, that it would be a major feat to put into a script. And perhaps they were a bit hesitant about the political content of the novel, and they stepped back. So they kept the option, and then it ran out in 18 months, and it would be lovely to get into some type of film production because it is written in a cinematic way, but very, very, very few novels end up as movies or TV series, so I can't really complain, but for a while there I had very high hopes.
We still do have high hopes because I think it's a wonderful novel, but admittedly it's a bit complex, especially for someone who's not familiar with the history of the Middle East. Ehab, I know that you, in conjunction with your poetry, you play music. How do you see it evolving? I mean your poetic career.
I don't play music. I tried to play music. I failed. But that's another story. I think you mean that there are some musicians who put my words to songs, and this is something I'm very, very happy with. It really gives the poem. Sometimes, rarely, I write as a song, but many times they just pick up my poems as they are and they put them to music, and that's lovely, a lovely experience. I just actually had an Arabic version of Imagine, John Lennon's Imagine, performed in Toronto to very high acclaim, and it's really well done. I mean, regardless of the words that are quite faithful to Lennon's words, Lennon Ono words, so I'll be politically correct, because she holds the part of the copyright. I was very happy with the performance. I'm also right now waiting for an anthology called Rumi Roaming to come out, where I have a couple of pieces in it, Arabic and English, and it's an anthology by writers of different origins across North America, and it's already in production. I mean, I don't have a release date yet, but my real hope is to publish an Arabic collection of poetry in Arabic only for Arab audience. I have enough material. I have romantic love poems in that one, and I really hope that time and life and publishing houses, politics would give me the chance to. I'd be really happy if that happens in the near future, but it's not in the books yet.
One last question. How important is the role of family and friends? Very briefly, because we want to open the floor for questions.
Right. So in terms of friends, writing friends, it was, for writing the second novel was extremely important. I think there were 28 other writers actually read versions of the novel. So I didn't have a development editor, but I certainly had the opinions of a lot of other writers as I was going along. And part of that was because I'd been involved with so many literary things. I ran the Prose in the Park Literary Festival for 3 years in Ottawa. I was the president of the Ottawa Independent Writers. So I had a lot of people who owed me favors. and were very happy to read the thing, give me their comments and the like. So friends, definitely. Family, perhaps less so. My brother helped me with the first novel. He was an avid reader. My mother read the second novel, as did my sister. So there was that kind of emotional support. But inside a family, you're not going to get a lot of literary advice. I mean, everything is good. I mean, how could they say it's not good because they're part of your family? So the family aspect was not so important in the creative process. But in the creative process, the advice, the reactions of friends to what they read in the earlier drafts of the novel was extremely, extremely useful.
What about you, Ehab?
If it wasn't my university friends ridiculing my poetry that I wrote during university, I wouldn't have gotten better. So I credit them for that really, really immensely. Some of them still ridicule my poetry till today, but but also I had some friends who gave me good advice. When I moved to Canada, I stopped being able to write in Arabic because I stopped thinking fully in Arabic, and I hesitated a lot to write in English because I didn't feel again that it's coming naturally. And as I mentioned earlier, poetry for me is really like spilling your guts, and if it doesn't come like that, it's very difficult. So many friends helped me, encouraged me, and then some helped me again when I went back, could say, to writing in Arabic again, which happened only maybe 10 years after that. So yeah, I appreciate the role of friends and family included, of course.
Thank you very much. That's all for my questions. Now, I'm sure we will have more questions from the floor.
There is a ceiling mic, I think it picks up, right?
Yes.
So go ahead.
Okay, so my question has to do with outrage as a creative fuel, and whether that plays a role in your writing, for both Ian and Ehab.
Do I go first? Sure. Absolutely, being connected, being active, having an opinion for or against things, being inspired by people has a big role in my writing. If we wanted to make a parallel, how can you get out a love poem without a muse? And it's the same thing for social causes, for political causes, for the likes.
Thank you.
So, in my personal life, I can certainly feel outrage at certain things. However, I avoid it in my writing because I see it as not productive, not constructive. At the end of the day, if there's a conflict, the easy way out is just to be completely on one side, okay? And to express that point of view. But if you want to see an end to a conflict, you have to present both sides. You have to explain the human experience that brought people to a conflict. And if you're feeling outrage in what you're writing, I think you do an injustice to that purpose. Now, on the other hand, I did write a couple of short stories for my anthology about climate change. And there was a lot of humor in it, but there was a fair degree of outrage because I feel that when it comes to climate change, I feel more free in expressing outrage because I think I can bring everyone into that outrage of what's going on with our planet and how we have to make a difference. So there are subjects that I can invest my own outrage into in my writing, and there are others where I choose not to.
the Zoom?
We have some from Zoom, but maybe you want to take another in person, and then we can switch.
Go ahead.
It's for Ehab. You said something that struck me. You said when talking about translation of poetry, and I know it's notoriously difficult, but I've always thought of it being about the language and the sound and the musicality. You said the images are not the same. And I'm wondering if it may not be possible since I don't speak Arabic, but I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit and give an example or something to give us a better idea of how they differ.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, it's difficult for me to give you an example right now, but let's talk about proverbs, for example. There are many proverbs that have equivalent in different languages, but using a different animal, for example. In this language, you're using one animal, in that language or that culture, you're using another animal for the same thing. Same thing about beauty, for example. You can use a color or whatever, or a style of hair to express beauty. In another culture, that would not be what they express beauty with. So you have to change the image to adapt it to the other culture if you wanted to connect, or you put a footnote at the end that in Arabic culture, this is considered beautiful, or something like that.
Thank you.
And maybe later I can find some concrete examples and then we can exchange about that. Sure.
Okay.
Oh, I forgot to turn the mic on. I'm sorry.
Okay, can I ask Ehab a question, a follow-up? Yes, Samaa, can I ask Ehab?
Sure.
So is it that the images are different, or just the metaphors that you're imagining something, or is it even in poetry that you think of images as opposed to thinking about raw feelings that come out in images in different cultures in different ways?
Again, this can be a subject that needs specific examples to be able to connect really. But I'll tell you one thing. I don't know if it answers your question. Sometimes when I'm reading in Canadian literature about the snow landscape in the winter, I get in my mind a desert landscape because there is so much similarity. That this flows non-end, and you get lost in it and you blah, blah, blah. And if you get in the middle, you never get out, and all that stuff we learned about the desert. So it's many sides, it's many aspects of the picture really that my hesitation comes through in that.
So we'll take one more question from Sandra and then John. Thank you.
So my question is for Ian. Ian, as a former activist and now a writer, you talked about your book with conflict and understanding both sides of the story. But I want to just bring it up to what we're watching now in Gaza and the horrendous, I don't know what to call it, I'd call it a genocide. Where do you see that there are two sides to the story? Because you're talking about being rational, listening to both sides. Everything I'm looking at, there isn't another side to talk to.
So, just as a bit of history, 40 years ago, Sandra and I were very involved in the movement against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And we organized demonstrations here, and we worked very actively with Palestinians and Lebanese Canadians, everyone. So when I
was there too.
and Samaa was also part of our group, okay?
I wasn't there, I'm too young.
And it's after that I lived in Gaza, and I worked for Global Affairs Canada for many years as a diplomat and the like. So being an active activist was not an option for me as a diplomat. However, what I would say is the following, two things. When we organized those demonstrations here in Montreal, there were a lot of Jewish people that demonstrated with us, that shared our values and tried to get the message across. So there was no divide between being Jewish or non-Jewish or Arab. We were working together to try to end the war in Lebanon, the invasion of Lebanon. Today, I spend a lot of my time on the internet, perhaps too much, and I listen to the journalists that cover what's happening in Gaza. and Gabor Mate, others. Almost everyone who's speaking up for the Gazan people, the people in Gaza, Palestinian people in Gaza, the majority of them, as I see, the most active advocates are Jewish. I mean, it's a reality. Progressive Jewish people have taken a stand to denounce what's happening to the people in Gaza. So when I want to say both sides of the story, I'm not there to justify the mentality of Jewish settlers in the West Bank and extremists like Ben Gvir or Smotrich. This is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying inside the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community in the diaspora, there are many, many strong voices for peace. And not a peace which means the one side wins and dominates the other, but peace that means coexistence and equality and democracy. And so I want to make sure that in writing, my writing, that I equally represent those voices as well as the voices of people that have suffered and are part of the Palestinian resistance or part of Palestinian society or Lebanese society. In the same way, in my novel, there I tried to represent the progressive voices among Christian Lebanese and among Muslim Lebanese, that there were reasons why they're in the conflict, and yet at the same time there were Muslims and Christians that came together to try to solve the conflict. So when I say both sides, I want to show that there's humanity on both sides, and that when people are reasonable and show empathy, they come together with a common message, The problem is the message has to be understood by the international community. If the international community decides that one side is completely right and the other side is completely wrong, this is where we get these distorted situations where we have the United States funding a horrible war, and we have the Canadian government also being complicit in things that it should not be complicit in. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sandra, but that's where I'm coming from today in 2024. I may have not been as mature back 40 years ago to have the same way of thinking. I mean, maybe I was more emotional at the time. I can't really remember. But I hope that gives you a partial answer to your question.
I can remember, Ian, you were much more, let's say, for the Palestinian side. Now, I think...
I'm always for the Palestinian side.
We have a question from the internet. John, yes, please.
Yeah, I think this one is from when we were talking about the women in your books. Somebody asks, who are the Middle Eastern women authors that you two read? What Canadian women authors do you read? As well as any non-binary authors from either the Middle East or Canada that you read.
I think it's pretty easy. I read Cora Siri, who's a very talented novelist. I read Caroline Vu, who's a very talented novelist, I read, I am Ariel Sharon, and the name of that author is, help me.
Yara El-Ghadban.
Yara.
El-Ghadban.
Yeah, exactly. So I've read her, I'm sure I've read, a dozen, Arab and Canadian authors that are contemporary. All the names don't come to mind. I have a lot of friends that are women authors, and I read what they write, and I think that I draw some good points from them for my own writing. Again, I'm a male writer, and I think that the reality is that the way we see the world as males may differ from the way women see the world, but we have to be authentic in our writing, and we should be trying to imitate the way another gender writes for any reasons. We should write from the heart.
Regarding Canadian Western English language writers, I really read men and women without distinction. I don't like try to choose this or that, and I really, because there is an abundance of both. Now, the more important part of the question that I want to touch on is that growing up in the Middle East, and maybe Samaa would like to jump into that, but there was really it was a difficult task to find women writers, and particularly women poets. Like Kulthum, for all her repertoire, does not have one song written by a woman. And Kulthum died in the 70s. So it's the reality of the issue. So I was always looking for works by Arab women, and when there were books, novels mostly, that made hits, I grabbed them and read them right away, because I was quite interested to see the material that they produce. Now I think the picture is quite different. I think this
much worse.
Much worse?
Yeah.
No. I mean the 99:1 ratio maybe became 75-25. I mean it truly got better. I mean there are women on the literary scene in the Arab world right now, yet the dominant force is still in both literature, novels, short stories, poetry is surely male dominated.
Yeah, absolutely, it's male dominated, but also I remember in Egypt in the 60s and 70s, there was an Arab women's federation or authors. It was not, of course, as well known as the counter one, the males, but still there was some production for sure.
There was some, but rare and far between. Really rare and far between. Yeah. Now it's a bit better. There are names like Ahlam Mustaghanmi. There are names in poetry. There are names that establish themselves in the Arab literary world, but it is nowhere close to the English or the French scene in writing.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Don't ask me to remember names because I'm terrible at remembering the names, but definitely in Lebanon and among the Palestinians, the production of fiction and poetry by women was very, very strong at some point. There was an issue that many of them were Christian Arabs, and they were making their works accessible because they could write. They could have it translated into English, or they could write in English or in French. But definitely in Palestine and in Syria and in Lebanon and these countries, there was a very strong literary movement among women. It may have not been at the same level as men, but then again, 30 years ago in Canada, when you went to Chapters, and if Chapters existed back then, you wanted to buy a novel, they're mostly by men, and now, when you go to buy a novel in Canada, a Canadian novel, I would say they're mostly by women. So there's been a change.
And I will add, to be fair, that my full exposure to the Arab literary scene was 30 plus years ago, and my full exposure to the English literary scene is now. So there's not only two scenes in parallel, there is also the two eras, and things might have changed in both during those years, unbeknown to me.
I was also going to say that, yes, Yara Rathban, that I want to say about I Am Ariel Sharon, she's written other novels, but there's also Monia Sayih up in Ottawa, who's also written a number. She's a Tunisian, is written in French and translated to English. So if we put aside kind of the very famous Random House authors, there's a fairly strong emerging group of Arab writers that are women in Canada and in the United States also. So we're seeing a period of a flourishing where the Arab woman experience is becoming known in North America for the first time in a long time, but it still is a relatively new phenomenon.
We're a young generation of immigrants, and some of them, especially mentioned in the States, are writing in English. I mean, whether they're originally from Arab countries and they're writing in English. So what we want to do is encouraging more women and men to write in Arabic or English, and we thank the Quebec Writers Federation for motivating everyone to write and to be more involved in literature. Thank you so much.
Is there anything else?
Anything else, John?
There are more questions, but it is 8:28. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
What about, do you agree, Ian? One more question? Okay. Yes, please, John.
Sure. Yeah. This one came into the chat. I have a lot of anger in me about injustice, and I feel paralyzed when I want to write about that topic. What would you, as writers, recommend someone do to overcome that paralysis?
So the question becomes, what the injustice is. Is it a personal injustice? Many writers write about being traumatized in their childhood. It's a fair topic, and they put it into their writing. It becomes very therapeutic to put that down on paper as such. If it's a question of political injustice that you feel that one side is being persecuted and you feel very outraged over that, you can write about it. But I think when you come to political issues, you have a responsibility. Are you going to write something which is, because of your outrage, becomes an incitement against another group, okay? And you have to draw the line. I don't think that in writing fiction, we should be inciting violence against another group, whatever is happening in the world. I think that as writers, we should have a social responsibility to seek some type of peaceful coexistence, resolution of things. That's my personal view. I will respect it, if someone just lays it out and writes a very angry novel, where against, people they feel are doing very bad things in the world, evil things, or whatever. I don't believe in evil, but that may be legitimate, but it's not the type of writing that I would appreciate, I would appreciate writing that tries to bring about some type of balance and brings people closer together, as opposed to writing that pushes people away.
Of course, it's difficult to answer the question without knowing what is the purpose of writing in the question, and I think writing has you write for many reasons, and you have an audience, or you're writing for a limited audience, or you're writing for yourself. I mean, all these are questions that are important before one answers this question. But I don't believe that, some people, and comment on what Ian said, some people, like established writers who have an audience, write dystopian novels in this kind of situation, because they don't, it's a parallel universe that they express this feeling that they have in, which is again legit, and it's not against a particular group of people, but it's more expressing how they see the world and how they see the future. So there are ways to write, but at the end of the day, if if you're too angry and you really want to curse and shout, write for yourself in a notebook. Don't even write on a cloud because you don't know where that can go.
No, better still call our Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, if you are angry at what's happening in Gaza.
Be firm but polite.
Actually, I got a message today saying, if call your MP. I call my MP every day. I call my MP 3 times a day, which I thought was excessive, but if you're really angry, you can do that. Any other question, John? The very last one, then.
This one actually is somebody in the audience who wants to speak aloud, I believe. So I'm going to let Joe from the audience talk, and we're going to see if this works with our audio setup.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Hi, Joe, yeah.
absolutely.
I'd like to address a comment and a question to Ian. I was a little uncomfortable about the way he characterized these two communities of, the Israelis and the Arabs. He suggested initially that they were essentially two solitudes, not unlike probably Québécois, Anglophone, and the Francophone, that don't really communicate, don't speak to each other, and have all sorts of perceptions. I can't speak very much about the Arab or the Palestinian community, but I do know that there is a very large constituency in Israel that not only relates to Palestinians and Arabs, but they actually work with them in organizations such as Hand in Hand, which is a system of schools throughout Israel that has 50% of the student body, as well as the staff, as Palestinians or Arabs, and the other half are Israeli Jews. And they have to deal on a day-to-day basis, not only with the curriculum, but on what we're dealing with right now. Additionally, there are organizations such as MUNA, Palestinian Initiatives, or internship program, which promotes Palestinians and Arabs in the workplace with advanced skills, high-tech skills. So there's a lot happening that I think escapes the media when they talk about these two solitudes. That's really the one thing. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
The other issue I really wanted to address was something that your two guests might want to tackle, and that is with respect to compassion concerning the two communities. And again, I'm only familiar with one side. I can tell you about a personal story. I happen to know a woman who...
sir, tell us, please, what is your question?
I'm getting to that. The compassion I'm concerned about is, to what degree can we really look forward to this? This woman actually experienced a tremendous tragedy. Her brother was killed by a suicide bomber in a bus. And she channeled her rage and her hatred into a creative project. It was called the Mandala Project, and I think that what was really remarkable about it is that she invited a lot of people into her life in this collectivity that otherwise she would not have been able to. And I would like to know if either of your speakers could address
I'm going to invite the authors now to comment on what you said. Thank you.
So, was Joe, right? Was the name? Yeah. So I'm sorry if you may have not completely understood what I was saying. You know, there are people in Israel, there are people in the Jewish community and the diaspora that work very hard okay, and trying to build bridges with the Palestinian community. That does exist, okay? And I admire those people. However, what I was saying is now, in 2024, 2023, the violence that has taken place, the war in Gaza, has created a polarization which is very, very deep between Palestinians and Israelis. There was a poll out that had 94% of the Israeli population, Jewish population that is, saying that they thought the Israelis' army's use of violence against the Palestinians was legitimate, that it should be even more in some cases, they were saying. So when I lived in Gaza, I was in Israel all the time because I could go in and out as an international employee. And there were the sentiment, the strength of the peace movement in 93 and 94 was, 100 times stronger than today. There were people there who had the compassion, the empathy, and the like. So I think that it would be a bit delusional to think that the peace movement has not been weakened by this perpetual cycle of violence. That's not to say that all those organizations you mentioned are not authentic and they're doing good work, but I think in actual numbers, when we look at what's taking place, they are a weakened peace movement. And in my view, the answer to that is to strengthen them. The strength right now has to come from outside of Israel. These people that are working for peace inside Israel have to be supported by the communities outside Israel. And that is the Jewish community in the diaspora, and that is also the non-Jewish community in the diaspora. They have to be promoting these people and their idealism. But unfortunately, the reality is that many people in the diaspora have a very strong commitment to Israel, whatever Israel does, whatever Israeli government is in charge, and this is weakening the peace movement in Israel. At the same time, I think you have to be realistic. If you were a Palestinian in Gaza, with all the bombing, with all that's happened to you, you're going to be angry at the people that have done this. This perpetual violence is creating a reaction, it's creating more extreme responses in the future. It does no purpose, it serves no one's security, doesn't serve the security of Israelis, it doesn't serve the security of Palestinians, obviously, and that we have to be working to stop the violence in the first step, and that's what the Canadian government should be doing, to stop the violence, and then we should be working to strengthen the peace movement on both sides, because only a strengthened peace movement on both sides is going to bring a resolution to this situation. So I hope I'm clearer now, about what I was trying to say earlier. You can agree or not agree with me, that's fine, but those are my views.
Thank you, Ehab. Do you have anything to add?
No, I just want to tell Joe that we are all, I think, aware that there are a lot of conscientious voices among the Jewish community. Small percentage, but very, very clear and very strong, and that's undeniable. And right now, actually, there is a lot of leading in the condemnation of what's happening in Gaza by Jewish voices here in Canada. But I mean, to be realistic, there is a lot more that needs to be done. And percentage-wise, I think there is a problem. So it's not denying the good voices, the strong voices, the fair voices, but the bigger picture is not rosy, and that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the event, and I would like to present you with a souvenir from the Quebec Writers Federation and Muslim Awareness Week.
Maybe you could explain what these are.
Okay, let's see. This is the title of Ehab's book, To Love a Palestinian Woman, and the title is written in Arabic. And this is for men. So it's the quilt of the dove written in Arabic again. You can see the dove here. And we put soft colors because this would be a peaceful call for peace. And you have the colors are a bit dark because I thought that his book was on the sad side, but just as beautiful. Thank you very much.